Okay, so here's our quick video about God's perfect goodness. So when we talk about God's omnibenevolence, what we're talking about is God's perfect goodness. So and you might have a rough and ready idea of what it means to be perfectly good, right? So God obviously won't won't commit acts that we think are normally morally wrong, and so God doesn't steal or sin or anything like that. But there are two different interpretations of perfect goodness that we'll get into in just a second. But you might wonder, why does God have to be perfectly good? Why can't God just be really good? Right? Why can't God just be doing the best he can? Right? So he created the whole entire universe. He's all powerful. He knows everything there is to know. But every once in a while, he makes a moral mistake. Right? Why is that so bad? Because many religions have thought that God has to be perfectly good. They describe that as one of his essential attributes. So why would that be? So it's often said that God has to be perfectly good because that would be uh, any God that failed to be perfectly good wouldn't be worthy of our worship. Right? So think of two gods. Right? You have one who's just uh, generally doing a pretty good job, right? But every once in a while he makes a moral mistake. And then think of another God who never makes a moral mistake. Which one is more worthy of our worship? I think everybody probably feels the same way. It's God number two. Right, so God number one, and so this is similar to Dr. Craig's point in the video above. The God who's just doing his best, we might admire him, but in order to devote our lives to worship of a God, we would want him to be morally perfect, make no moral mistakes. So why do we think God has to be perfectly good? Well, because that's the type of God we think is worthy of worship. And we'll talk about this a little bit more next week. But when you think of God, right, you don't want to think of a being and then be able to think of another being that's greater than God, right? That seems contradictory. God's supposed to be the best possible being or the greatest conceivable being, however you want to say it. God's supposed to just have all of these perfections. So if we think of God making some moral mistake, we can always think of a God better, higher up on the scale, right? One who's more perfect. And so we don't want him to make any moral mistakes because then we could just think of a greater being and that thing would be God instead. Right? So God needs to be perfectly good. But in addition to all of that, there seems to be two separate ways you can interpret the claim that God is perfectly good. So take just a second to yourself to think about how could you differentiate between two different interpretations of perfect goodness? Okay, hopefully you paused and thought about that for a second. So for God to be perfectly good, does that mean either one, that God just doesn't even have the option to perform morally bad acts, right? So God is sitting there up in wherever he is outside of space and time, and he's thinking about an action he'd like to perform. And God says, hey, you know what? I would like to know what it feels like to sin. Right? I'd like to try it out just once, and it'll just be a tiny little minor sin, right? Like I'll tell somebody a lie that won't actually have a negative impact on their life. But I'd just like to know what it's like to do something that's not morally perfect. Now, on this first interpretation, God would try to do that, and he just couldn't actually do it. Right? So God would try to tell the lie, but his moral perfection would make it impossible for him to tell this white lie. Right? So there's the first type of interpretation, that God just doesn't even have the option to perform morally wrong acts. The second way of interpreting the idea that God is perfectly good is that God does have the option to perform morally wrong acts, but he just never would. And so how is this different? So think about the same little scenario. God wants to tell a white lie. On this second interpretation, he can, right? He could go over to any human on the planet and whisper a little white lie in their ear, and then go on his way. But he just never would do that because he reflects and thinks about performing a morally wrong act, and he just realizes that's something that he doesn't want to do. He wouldn't ever do that. So there are the two separate ways of thinking of God's perfect goodness. Number one, it's impossible for him to ever do anything wrong. Number two, it's possible, he just wouldn't do it. So I'd spend some time thinking about which interpretation you think better describes perfect goodness. Right? So when you think about someone being perfectly good, which of those two interpretations comes to mind and why? And that's part of what you'll be answering in the discussion board for this week. So I'll leave it at that, give you some time to think about it, and we'll move on to talk about God's other attributes. Thank you.